There's something quietly unsettling happening in Britain at the moment, not dramatic, not explosive, just unsettling. Because for millions of pensioners, the state pension is not an abstract government policy, it is survival. It is the direct debit that leaves on a Tuesday morning, the heating bill, the weekly groceries, the small mental calculations people make every day without even noticing anymore. And lately, more pension recipients are opening letters, checking online accounts, or glancing at bank statements and noticing deductions they did not expect. Sometimes the amount is small, sometimes it is tax-related, sometimes it involves overpayment recovery or changes buried deep inside administrative systems. But the thing people are starting to notice is not only the deduction itself, it is the feeling that comes with it. Because many pensioners are not simply asking where the money went, they are asking whether anything still feels predictable, and I think that is why this conversation has become emotionally larger than the numbers involved. For decades, the idea of the state pension carried a certain emotional meaning in Britain. It represented stability, not luxury, not comfort without limits, but a kind of social reassurance. You worked, you contributed, you reached retirement age, and in return there was supposed to be a dependable floor beneath you. Now that floor feels less solid than people expected. You can almost feel the anxiety sitting underneath these stories, especially among older people who grew up believing institutions, while imperfect, were ultimately understandable. Rules existed, systems made sense, payments arrived. You trusted the process because the process usually behaved consistently. But modern bureaucracy feels different now, more fragmented, more automated, more difficult to follow. Letters arrive filled with technical language. Helplines place people on hold for hours. Online portals replace human explanations. And honestly, for many elderly people, that experience can feel deeply isolating. What is interesting is that younger generations watching this unfold recognize the emotional pattern immediately, because uncertainty has become normal for them. Wages fluctuate, rent increases suddenly, contracts disappear, prices rise without warning. Economic instability has shaped much of adult life for younger workers, but pensioners were never supposed to experience life this way. That is the psychological shift people are reacting to. The state pension was once associated with certainty, a fixed point at the end of decades of work, and now even that fixed point appears vulnerable to adjustments, recalculations, deductions, and administrative revisions that many recipients struggle to fully understand. And maybe that is the point. Because this story is not only about pensions, it is about trust, trust in systems, trust in institutions, trust that promises made over a lifetime still carry meaning when people finally need them most. Once that trust begins to weaken, the emotional consequences spread very quickly. The conversation seems to be shifting toward a broader public feeling that ordinary people are increasingly expected to navigate systems so complicated that even experts struggle to explain them clearly. Pension credits, tax thresholds, national insurance contributions, benefit recalculations, recovery notices, eligibility reviews, administrative corrections. Modern government systems are incredibly sophisticated, but sophistication does not always feel humane, and I keep coming back to that word, humane. Because every deduction, no matter how technically justified, lands inside a real human life. A pension payment is not merely a number moving through a government database. It determines whether somebody feels safe enough to turn their heating on, whether they buy fresh food or cheaper alternatives, whether they sleep peacefully or spend the evening worrying they misunderstood a letter from the Department for Work and Pensions. That emotional pressure matters, especially because many pensioners are already carrying other forms of vulnerability: rising energy costs, long waiting lists in healthcare, loneliness, bereavement, reduced mobility, fear of becoming dependent on relatives, fear of losing independence entirely. Financial uncertainty rarely arrives alone. And it is strange because Britain often describes itself as a society that respects older generations. Politicians regularly speak about protecting pensioners. Campaigns celebrate retirees who contributed throughout their lives. Public language around pensions still carries this moral undertone of earned security, but the lived experience sometimes feels very different. For many pensioners, dealing with the modern welfare and tax system can feel exhausting, not because they lack intelligence, but because the system increasingly assumes confidence with digital tools, endless paperwork, and complicated financial terminology. The thing people are starting to notice is that vulnerability today does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like an elderly person sitting quietly at a kitchen table reading the same government letter over and over again, trying to understand whether they have done something wrong. And honestly, there is something profoundly sad about that image. Not theatrical sadness, not political slogan sadness, just quiet human sadness, Because after decades of work, many people imagined retirement would bring a slower rhythm of life, more predictability, more peace. Instead, some now describe feeling trapped inside constant administrative uncertainty, and of course there are opposing views here that deserve attention. There are economists and government officials who argue these deductions are often legitimate and necessary. Overpayments do happen. Tax rules still apply after retirement. Public finances are under enormous pressure. Britain has an aging population, increasing healthcare costs, and long-term economic challenges that no government can easily avoid. That perspective matters too. A modern state cannot function entirely through emotion. Systems require rules. Mistakes sometimes need correcting. Governments balance limited resources against expanding demand, and many officials would argue the majority of pension payments continue arriving exactly as intended, but public confidence is not built through technical explanations alone. People need clarity, predictability, communication that feels understandable and respectful, because politics is emotional long before it becomes statistical. And maybe this is why stories about pension deductions resonate far beyond the individuals directly affected. They tap into a wider national mood that has been quietly forming for years now, a feeling that life in Britain has become more administratively complicated, more financially fragile, and somehow less emotionally secure. You can sense this mood across almost every generation. Young workers worry they will never own homes. Parents worry about childcare and energy costs. Middle-aged families worry about mortgages and stagnant wages. Pensioners worry about deductions and rising bills. Different problems, similar emotional atmosphere, a constant low-level uncertainty. And I think people are beginning to recognize how politically significant that uncertainty could become, because once enough citizens feel emotionally disconnected from institutions, trust erodes slowly but deeply, not through sudden outrage, through accumulated exhaustion. That process is difficult to reverse. What is particularly striking is how quietly these pension stories spread through communities. They move through conversations in pharmacies, local waiting rooms, supermarkets, church halls, neighborhood Facebook groups. Someone mentions a deduction they did not understand, and immediately somebody else has experienced something similar. That is usually how social anxiety grows, through repetition, through shared recognition, and maybe politicians underestimate how powerful those conversations become over time. Because most people do not experience government through parliamentary speeches or policy papers, they experience it through practical moments, a delayed payment, a confusing letter, a helpline that never answers, a deduction that suddenly appears without warning. Those small interactions shape public trust far more than grand political messaging. And there is another layer to this story that feels important. Britain is aging. The number of retired citizens continues growing, which means pension policy is no longer a niche issue affecting a small minority. It sits at the center of national life now. Families discuss it constantly because retirement insecurity no longer belongs only to older generations. Younger people are watching carefully and asking themselves whether the same uncertainty will eventually reach them too. That creates a very different political environment, because once younger generations stop believing retirement will provide stability, the entire emotional contract between citizens and the state begins to change. People start saving differently, voting differently, thinking differently about work, taxation, and public institutions. The consequences become cultural as much as economic. And honestly, you can already feel that shift beginning. There is this growing feeling that many traditional assumptions about British life are quietly dissolving. The assumption that hard work guarantees stability, the assumption that public institutions remain dependable, the assumption that retirement naturally leads to peace of mind. None of these assumptions disappear overnight. They fade gradually. That is what makes moments like this so emotionally powerful. They reveal changes people have sensed for years but struggled to articulate clearly. And perhaps this is why the reaction to pension deductions feels bigger than the policy itself. It symbolizes something wider, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. The fear that stability itself is becoming temporary, the fear that every system now contains hidden uncertainty. And maybe that explains why even relatively modest deductions can provoke such deep emotional reactions, because they arrive inside a country already carrying enormous economic anxiety. Inflation has reshaped household budgets. Public services remain under pressure. Housing insecurity affects millions. Many people feel permanently one unexpected expense away from serious financial stress. So when pension deductions appear unexpectedly, they connect instantly to that wider atmosphere of fragility, not just financial fragility, emotional fragility. And I keep wondering what this means for the future political conversation in Britain. Will governments eventually simplify welfare systems entirely? Will pension protections become stronger? Will public trust continue eroding quietly year after year? Or will this growing anxiety eventually force a wider national reckoning about economic security and dignity in old age? Nobody really knows. And perhaps the uncertainty itself is what unsettles people most, because beneath all the technical debates about tax codes and payment systems sits a deeply human question. What does society owe people after a lifetime of contribution? Not only financially, emotionally too. Do older citizens deserve systems that feel calm, understandable, and dependable? Should retirement provide psychological security as well as economic support? Or has modern life simply become too unstable for any institution to promise certainty anymore? Those questions linger long after the headlines disappear, because this story is not ultimately about deductions. Not really. It is about whether people still believe the structures surrounding their lives are designed with ordinary human beings in mind, and right now there is a growing sense that many do not. There is also something generational happening beneath all this that rarely gets discussed openly. Many pensioners belong to a generation raised to avoid complaining. They endured shortages, recessions, industrial decline, and periods of national uncertainty with a kind of quiet endurance that politicians often praise publicly. But endurance has limits, and what feels different now is that more older people seem willing to admit they feel anxious, confused, or overlooked by systems they once defended instinctively. That matters politically because emotional shifts among older voters tend to signal broader cultural changes. Pensioners have traditionally been viewed as one of the most institutionally trusting groups in British society. They voted consistently, followed the rules carefully, believed in administrative order. So when that same generation begins expressing uncertainty about whether government systems still work fairly, people pay attention. And honestly, maybe younger generations should pay attention too, because the deeper issue here is not simply retirement. It is the relationship between citizens and the state during moments of vulnerability, illness, aging, financial pressure, bereavement. Those are the moments when public systems reveal their true character. A compassionate system does not only distribute money efficiently, it reduces fear, it communicates clearly, it allows people to retain dignity even while asking for support. And I think that is what many pensioners feel is slowly disappearing, not assistance entirely, but dignity within the process. The forms become more complicated, the language becomes colder, the explanations become harder to reach. Everything feels slightly more transactional than before. Maybe that is inevitable inside a modern economy shaped by automation, budget pressure, and administrative scale, or maybe societies slowly drift toward impersonality when efficiency becomes more politically valued than reassurance. But either way, people notice the emotional texture of these interactions. They remember how institutions made them feel, and perhaps years from now, that emotional memory will matter just as much as the financial figures themselves. Because in the end, people can tolerate complexity more easily than they can tolerate uncertainty wrapped in silence. They can adapt to difficult circumstances if they believe somebody is speaking to them honestly and treating them with care. But when systems feel distant, confusing, and emotionally detached, even small deductions begin carrying a much heavier symbolic weight inside public consciousness.